51 times. The Cleveland Browns allowed their quarterbacks to be sacked 51 times last season. 51 in 17 games. That is 3 sacks per game, every game, for an entire NFL season. That is a number so staggering, so historically embarrassing, so completely indefensible that Pro Football Focus ranked that offensive line 31st out of 32 teams, dead last in pass protection, dead last in consistency, dead last in every metric that matters when you are trying to evaluate whether the people standing in front of your quarterback are actually doing their jobs. And of those 51 sacks, 23 of them came in 7 games from one specific quarterback, a 5th-round draft pick who had never played a professional snap before November, a young man who was running for his life on nearly 4 out of every 10 dropbacks he took, who was trying to learn the NFL at the same time he was being physically mangled by it, who was somehow, impossibly, defiantly, in a way that no stat line can fully capture, still making plays. That was the reality of Shedeur Sanders' rookie season. Not the 10 interceptions, not the 56.6 completion percentage, not the 18.8 QBR that ranked as the worst single-season mark in Browns franchise history. Those numbers, as brutal as they are on paper, do not tell the story of what actually happened. The story of what actually happened is 23 sacks. 4 starting offensive linemen going down with season-ending injuries before the season was half finished. Patchwork replacements being emergency signed off practice squads and thrown into starting roles they were never supposed to fill. A quarterback being dropped into the middle of all that chaos and told, go win football games. Against NFL defenses, against pass rushers who had been preparing all week specifically to destroy whatever was standing in front of this particular quarterback. And now on March 25th, 2026, that story is being rewritten. Not with a press conference, not with optimistic quotes from a general manager who is under enormous pressure to get this right, but with money, real money, committed aggressively, targeted precisely, spent in ways that tell you more about what this organization believes about their quarterback than anything Andrew Berry has said publicly since January. The Cleveland Browns are assembling an offensive line that has never been seen before in this franchise's modern history. And what they are building, piece by piece, contract by contract, with a clarity of purpose that has been missing from this organization for years, is the wall that Shedeur Sanders has always deserved and never had. Let me tell you how it started. Because the way this offensive line rebuild began, the specific sequence of events, the timing and the strategy and the execution, reveals something important about how differently this organization is operating under the pressure of Jimmy Haslam's 12-day ultimatum. It did not start with the legal tampering window opening. It did not start with a bidding war in free agency where desperate teams drive up prices by competing against each other. It started with a phone call to Houston, quiet, strategic, before anyone else could bid. On March 2nd, 2026, Ian Rappaport broke the news that sent the first shockwave through the NFL offseason. The Browns and the Houston Texans had agreed to terms on a trade sending starting right tackle Titus Howard to Cleveland in exchange for a 5th-round draft pick, and Howard was simultaneously receiving a new 3-year, $63 million extension, dogs by nature. March 2nd, days before free agency officially opened, before the chaos, before the prices inflated, before other teams could get involved. Andrew Berry identified his target, made his call, and locked in the deal, with the speed of an organization that had done its homework months in advance and was not interested in waiting for the market to drive up the cost. The move was described by Rappaport as much-needed OL help, which is the most NFL insider-speak way of saying that the Cleveland Browns' offensive line was in such desperate need of legitimate starting talent that acquiring a player of Howard's caliber felt like exactly as urgent as it sounds.
And what is Titus Howard? What specifically does he bring to a unit that was ranked 31st in the entire league last season? The numbers that made Berry write that 3-year, $63 million check tell the story clearly. Howard allowed just a 4.8% pressure rate in 2025, a career best. On pass block snaps specifically, only 7 qualifying players in the entire NFL had a lower pressure rate than his 5.8% mark. Pro Football Network, 5.8%. Compare that to the pressure rate Shedeur Sanders was dealing with last season, nearly 40% of every dropback under pressure, and you begin to understand what Howard's presence actually means for what happens behind that line in 2026. He is not just an upgrade, he is a completely different standard of protection, the kind of standard that allows a quarterback to actually do his job rather than simply try to survive it. But Howard was just the beginning, because 3 years and $63 million was only the opening statement of what turned out to be the most aggressive, most comprehensive, most deliberately constructed offensive line spending spree this franchise has undertaken since returning to the NFL in 1999. And what came next was bigger, more expensive, and in many ways more revealing about exactly what Todd Monken is trying to build in Cleveland.
On the first day of the legal tampering window, the Browns agreed to terms with former Los Angeles Chargers guard Zion Johnson on a 3-year, $49.5 million deal with $32.4 million guaranteed. Heavy sports. $49.5 million for a guard. From a franchise that walked into this offseason $19.5 million over the projected salary cap, that restructured Watson's contract just to create breathing room that had been described by analysts as operating with essentially no financial flexibility. They found the flexibility. They found it because they had to find it, because the most urgent structural problem on this entire roster, the reason Shedeur Sanders threw 10 interceptions while being sacked 23 times in 7 games, was the offensive line. And you cannot fix that problem with a veteran minimum signing and a prayer. The number that made Berry spend $49.5 million on Zion Johnson is the number that Todd Monken walked into Cleveland carrying from Baltimore. Johnson's run-block win rate last season ranked in the 98th percentile across the entire NFL. Heavy sports. The 98th percentile. For a head coach who just spent 3 years in Baltimore building one of the most dominant run games in recent NFL history, who used the physical dominance at the line of scrimmage as the foundation of every explosive passing moment in that offense, who watched Lamar Jackson win MVP after MVP because defenses were forced to respect what was happening on the ground first. That number is not just impressive, it is the foundational element of the offensive identity he is installing in Cleveland. You run the football, you demand respect in the trenches, you create the play-action opportunities that make a young quarterback's life manageable, and you do all of that by having someone in the 98th percentile at the line of scrimmage doing it for you every single Sunday. The pass protection concern on Johnson is real and honest. His pass block grade was far less impressive than his run block number. USA Today's Nate Davis acknowledged the limitations while still declaring Sanders the big winner of Brown's free agency, writing that the offensive line investment, Tevin Jenkins re-signed, Titus Howard arrived via trade, and Zion Johnson and Elgton Jenkins both on the way, should mean a magnificent opportunity for Sanders to assert himself as QB1 in 2026. Heavy sports. Magnificent opportunity. From a national analyst who covers all 32 teams and has no particular rooting interest in Cleveland, looking at what was built in free agency and concluding that the environment being constructed around this quarterback is genuinely, meaningfully better than what existed before. And then, Elgton Jenkins, the signing that flew somewhat under the radar compared to the Howard trade and the Johnson deal, but that may ultimately prove to be the most clever, most schematically important addition of the entire rebuild. Jenkins has given up only 9 total sacks in his 7-year NFL career across 6,358 total snaps, meaning he allows a sack once every 706 snaps, dogs by nature. Once every 706 snaps, from an offensive line that was allowing a sack once every roughly 30 snaps last season. The math is staggering. The improvement is enormous.
And the specific quality that makes Jenkins so valuable for what Cleveland is building is not just the pass protection number, it is the versatility. Jenkins can play both left guard and center, giving Todd Monken the kind of positional flexibility that allows an offensive coordinator to design protections, shift personnel, and create blocking schemes that defenses cannot simply game plan against because they never know exactly where Jenkins is going to line up. Dogs by nature. You do not just build a great offensive line with 5 great players. You build it with players who can move, who can adjust, who can be deployed based on what the defense gives you, rather than being locked into one position because that is the only spot they know how to play. Jenkins gives Monken options, real ones, and in a system that is already going to feature the run-blocking dominance of Zion Johnson and the pass protection reliability of Titus Howard, having a versatile, experienced, technically precise veteran who can play 2 positions well enough to start is the difference between a good offensive line and a genuinely dangerous one. And then, Tevin Jenkins, the guard who started the final 4 games of last season and showed enough to earn another contract, re-signed, kept in the building, because when you are rebuilding 4/5 of your starting offensive line simultaneously, you need the one piece who actually played meaningful snaps last year and performed well enough to keep his job. Tevin Jenkins is that piece. He is the continuity, the familiarity, the guy who knows the locker room and the terminology and the blocking concepts well enough that his presence stabilizes what would otherwise be a completely new group trying to build chemistry from scratch in an off-season program. 4 additions, over $100 million on one position group in the span of 10 days. That is what Andrew Berry did between March 2nd and March 11th, and the football world, which had spent months asking whether Cleveland was serious about giving Shedeur Sanders a real chance, finally had its answer. Not in words, in contracts, in trade calls and extension negotiations and free agent signings that collectively said the same thing in a language that every NFL analyst could read without needing a translator. ESPN's Daniel Oyefusi captured the logical directly. Realistically, the best pathway for the Browns and this current roster is for one of these incumbent guys to take off. And really, you're looking at Shedeur because he's younger and you saw some flashes this past year. That is, in an ideal world for the Browns, their pathway to contending in 2026 and beyond. Heavy sports.
Made more plays or got himself out of trouble than Monken expected. Now stop and really absorb what that means. Monken coached Lamar Jackson. He built the offensive system that produced one of the greatest quarterback seasons in NFL history. He has spent decades at the highest levels of football evaluating quarterback talent against the most demanding standard available. And the first time he watched Shedeur Sanders' tape, all of it, every snap, every play, his honest reaction was genuine positive surprise. Not, he was okay given the circumstances. Not, I can see why they invested the 5th-round pick. Genuine surprise at the pocket awareness, the improvisation, the playmaking ability that showed up even in the middle of the most hostile, most dangerous, most structurally broken offensive environment available in professional football. Now imagine what Monken sees when he closes his eyes and visualizes what Shedeur Sanders looks like behind the line that is being assembled in front of him. Howard at right tackle with a career-best pressure rate. Johnson at right guard with 98th percentile run blocking. Jenkins at left guard or center with 7 career sacks allowed in 6,358 snaps. Tevin Jenkins providing proven depth. And a 1st-round pick, potentially Monroe Freeling, about to anchor the blind side at left tackle. That is the wall. That is the structure. That is the environment where a head coach who was surprised by Shedeur Sanders' tape gets to find out what this quarterback actually looks like when the conditions are fair. And Andrew Berry himself pointed to exactly what he needs to see, saying, I think the biggest thing we want to see from Shedeur is just continued growth. I think he grew a lot from start 1 to start 7. Certainly playing more efficiently, not putting the ball in harm's way as much will be important, while maintaining the ability to produce out of structure and generate explosive plays. Heavy sports. Playing more efficiently, not putting the ball in harm's way, and here is the honest context that Berry was not saying out loud, but that every informed observer understands completely.
How much of the inefficiency was Shedeur Sanders, and how much was an offensive line that was ranked 31st in the entire league and gave up 51 sacks in a season? How much of the tendency to hold the ball too long was a quarterback who lacked trust in his protection and was desperately trying to buy time because he knew the pocket was going to collapse? And how much of that changes, how dramatically, how quickly, how visibly, when the protection is real? When he can trust the wall in front of him, when the 4-second clock in his head becomes a real 4 seconds rather than a theoretical one that disappears after 1.5. Nobody knows yet. That is the honest answer. Nobody knows what Shedeur Sanders looks like behind a functional offensive line in an NFL game because nobody has ever seen it. Not in Cleveland, not anywhere. His entire professional career has been defined by chaos, by injury-depleted lines, by emergency starters, by the constant physical threat that forced him into survival mode on almost every single snap he ever took wearing a professional jersey. And the experiment about to be conducted in training camp, in preseason games, and then in 17 regular season games beginning in September, the experiment of what this quarterback actually is when everything around him works, is genuinely one of the most fascinating, most consequential, most potentially transformative football experiments available in the entire NFL right now. Because here is what cannot be overstated. The Cleveland Browns just spent over $100 million on offensive linemen for a quarterback they have not officially named as their starter. They rebuilt 4/5 of their starting line in the span of 3 weeks for a quarterback that ESPN's Seth Walder publicly called the longest of shots to be starting in September. They are about to spend a first-round draft pick on left tackle, potentially the 6th overall pick in the entire draft, for a quarterback that multiple national analysts have suggested should be replaced before the season even begins. You do not do all of that for a quarterback you do not believe in. You do not make those financial commitments, those draft investments, those organizational bets for a placeholder, for a bridge, for a player you are planning to move on from the moment something better presents itself. The wall is being built. The Cleveland Browns allowed 224 total pressures, and the patchwork offensive line saw 4 of its 5 opening day starters suffer season-ending injuries in 2025. That unit will look completely different in 2026. ESPN. Completely different. Not marginally better, not incrementally upgraded. Completely different. Howard for the right side, Johnson for the run game foundation, Jenkins for the versatility and the pass protection reliability, Tevin Jenkins for the continuity, and a first-round pick for the left side, the blind side, the final piece of the armor that protects a quarterback's most vulnerable angle. And Shedeur Sanders, he's been here before. Not this specifically, not with a rebuilt offensive line and a new head coach and $100 million being spent specifically to protect him. He's never had this, but he has been in situations where the conditions were not fair and the environment was not right and the circumstances were stacked against him, and he's competed anyway. He's always competed anyway. From Jackson State to Colorado to the green room to the backup bench to the starting job he took in November and never gave back. The wall was never there before. It is being built now, and the player standing behind it, waiting for September, preparing for the most important season of his professional life, already knows exactly what to do with it. The Cleveland Browns have assembled something in front of Shedeur Sanders that this franchise has never assembled before. Not perfectly, not without remaining questions, the left tackle spot, the wide receiver need, the Watson competition that still technically exists, but meaningfully, substantially, genuinely better than anything that has ever existed between Shedeur Sanders and the pass rushers who spent last season making his professional debut a survival exercise rather than a development opportunity. The wall is being built. The quarterback is ready. And for the first time in a very long time, the city of Cleveland has something real to believe in heading into an NFL season.